He fumbled the football. Carolina holds. The game is over. And Carolina has won the game.
With 5 seconds, he's going to throw it. Howard leaps. He has it. Touchdown. Carolina back from the dead to tie the game with 2 seconds to go. There is a flag down, but holy smokes.
2 and 4 in overtime games. Carolina 1 and 3. Here from under center. Give off to Greg Little. Little pulls away. Little is going to score. Carolina wins.
Snap back, spot down. The kick is cleanly away. It is good! And it's Fowler with a 54-yard field goal. And how about them Tar Heels? They do it!
Possible win. Snap, spot, kick away, high enough, long enough. It's good! It's good! Carolina has won the game on a 42-yard field goal by freshman Hunter Burns.
In his end zone. The punt, very high. Switzer will have room to return it. He fields it at the 40. Coming near side, Switzer at the 50. Switzer, 45, cuts back at the 40. 35, breaks a tackle at the 30. Still on his feet. No, he's not. Yes, he is. Ryan Switzer for 6. He is doing his best Giovanni Bernard impression. Ryan Switzer again. Bernard fields it at the 26. Heading to the far side. Gio at the 35. Gio, he's at the 50. No, he's not. Yes, he is. Gio is going to take it for a touchdown. Are you kidding me?
What's going on, guys? Welcome into another edition of the Heel Tough Blog Podcast. It's your host, Anthony Pagnotta, with you guys here, as always. And tonight, another edition of the recruiting podcast. We are in the off season, so of course, plenty of recruiting news is going to be rolling in all throughout the summer, and we're going to have you covered across the board. And so that means that Zack Hubbard once again is back with me here tonight. And for the first time, Zack, in what feels like a long time, it is time to actually break down some commitments for the Tar Heels. And now the thing is that in the past week and a half, we've had commitments across the 2024 class, the 2025 class, and the 2026 class. So Carolina's been busy. They've sort of spanned these 3 different classes, found some key commitments in all of them, and we will talk about all of that here tonight. Also, a couple of updates for you guys on some guys on the 2025 recruiting trail that haven't necessarily announced their commitments, but they've taken big steps with their recruitments. And also a big fish in the state for 2026 narrows down his list. Is Carolina on that? We'll tell you all about that here tonight. But, let's start in the order that these commitments happen. So we'll start in the 2024 class. Carolina needing a running back. And I think this honestly has more to do maybe with the future rather than this year. But Carolina goes out. They add to the roster for this year with running back Charleston French. He's a guy that comes from the junior college ranks. Itawamba Community College was where he spent last year. And he comes in with 4 years of eligibility as well as a redshirt year if he wants it. So he's going to have plenty of opportunity to grow in this system. But Zack, I think the first thing is, what did you make of this pickup from Carolina? Because I really do feel like, while we did hear Mac Brown talk about wanting to add to this running back room at one time during the spring, it really feels like this is a move that is more centered around the future in that running back room.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of what we mentioned on the last edition of the recruiting side of the podcast is just how these numbers will be affected going into 2025. I mean, you look at who's on the roster this year. You have a graduate that came in from the portal in Darwin Barlow. He's going to be gone. Caleb Hood is a true senior. If he plays, over 4 games, unless he redshirts, he's probably gone. And then a guy like Marion Hampton entering his true junior year, feel like he's going to be one of the first running backs taken in this next upcoming draft. So that's 3 guys that you're likely going to lose after this 2024 season. Prior to the commitment of Charleston French that just left, a redshirt freshman in Jordan Louis, and then a true freshman in Davion Goss. So they need numbers at this position going into 2025, really from anywhere that they can get it. So I do agree that this move was for the future in terms of what he's going to be and how he's going to contribute to this team, just at the very least as a depth piece, as a body, to take reps, whether it be in games, in practice, whatever. They're going to need numbers at that position. You always do at running back because that's a position on the offense that you're going to have to rotate just to make sure that you can keep guys fresh, keep guys rotating, make sure that guys don't have wear and tear unless you have a guy like Amari and Hampton that can handle that load and is that much of a positive to you. It's a position where you want to, rotate guys. This is a guy that had a, pretty good first season in junior college, ran for, over 900 yards, a few touchdowns, had a little bit of, passes caught there as well for a few yards there. And then had a pretty good, final high school season as well, running for 1,600 yards. So there is, something here that can be worked with. When you put on the film, you don't necessarily see a guy that's going to be a blazer per se and just his top end speed, but I think he's got good acceleration. I think he's, decently twitchy in order to make some guys miss once he's in space. He's not necessarily a huge body sort of guy, only 5'9", right around that 200 range. So, not a huge bruiser of a back, but a guy that, once he gets past that sort of initial line of scrimmage, sort of outside of that scrum into the 3 and 4 yard range, he can turn that into 5, 6, 7 pretty easily, with just some moves there and making quick moves. So I think that the pickup is good from that perspective, not only because it's a body, but it's a guy that, he's an option for you. And he's a guy that can take roles in games, whether that be potentially in a starting role at the bare minimum, sort of in mop-up duty at the end of games in the fourth quarter when you sort of want to ice it away, run clock. I think he'll be a good option for that. I do think that we're going to have to wait and see what they add potentially in the high school ranks for 2025, as well as in the portal this offseason. But just for the time being, to go ahead and get this guy in, get him acclimated to what you want to do, I think it's a good move for everyone involved, and it's one that can really it's low risk but potential high reward here.
Yeah, that's kind of how I look at it as well. I think it's similar. I think there is more upside and potential there probably for Tyrone Stewart, but it's in the same ilk. Look, he's a guy that is built a little bit differently than a lot of the guys on the roster. You mentioned it, 5'9", which is very, very small for a running back. 205 though. So yeah, he is small, but he's built pretty solidly. I like, what I see from him. I think there's a good combination of speed and power there. Again, I don't know if any of it's really going to blow anybody away. This is a guy that is at the JUCO level for a reason. But there are some things that stick out that should have you encouraged. One, very decisive runner. He's a guy that when he sees the holes, which he does a good job of seeing them, even if they don't develop immediately, he's a guy that once that hole is there, he hits it just about every time. The biggest thing is for him coming in. I think you're right. Basically, what you're looking at him as is probably a member of the 2025 class that's just coming in this year and is going to sit and learn. I would be stunned if this year is not his redshirt year. I think, last year, solid production, something that you can work with. Nearly ran for 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns. It's a solid start to his career, and from his high school numbers, you can see there's potential there. But the thing is that mean, look, you don't know where exactly he played at in the high school ranks. Was this a school that, played stiff competition? That's the thing that you kind of wonder about. So for him, it's going to be navigating that learning curve. And I think, you look at the success that Carolina's had with their running backs, and they've done it before. They've done it with some lower ranked guys. Now, there are guys that typically they have coming out of the high school ranks. But, I mean, you go back to a guy like Javonte Williams when he came out, was far from the highest ranked prospect. And Carolina turned him into one of the best running backs in all of college football. So, yes, they have landed some highly ranked players there, but there are other times where they have simply just developed guys at that position. This could potentially be one of those guys. And the biggest thing to remember is that this is a guy that they could be looking at as the third running back in that room, or just an insurance option for if there are injuries. I do think that you mentioned the two guys that would be guaranteed to be on the roster next year. If this season, everything goes to plan. Omarion Hampton runs the ball incredibly well, continues to, impress and ends up going to the NFL. And then, Darwin Barlow's guaranteed to be gone. Caleb Hood, unless there's an injury that he is allowed to pick up a medical red shirt on, he'll be gone as well. You have two guys in that backfield that are both very talented in Jordan Louis and Davian Gauss, but they're guys that are going to need some insurance behind them. The thing I like about this the most is you mentioned we have to wait and see what they do on the 25 trail. This takes the pressure off of Carolina to have to land Bo Walker. If they don't land him, which he's the last guy out there now, Jabri Wallace-Coleman, he ended up committing to Penn State, as we thought once we started to see that Alvin Henderson was going to flip to Auburn. They end up landing him, and so Carolina's down to one guy. It's either flip Bo Walker or Carolina's going to end up not landing a running back in this class unless they end up offering someone as we get into early summer or into the fall. So I think Carolina, that this is the reason they went out and got him, and to get him in basically a year early while being your 2025 running back, or one of your 2025 running backs potentially. That'll be huge. The other thing is, you mentioned it, they will go to the transfer portal to find somebody. You are talking about two guys that are guaranteed to be underclassmen, more than likely being the guys that will be heading up the effort in that backfield. There's also a really good chance, and who knows, I mean, Davian Gauss showed some nice flashes. There's a good chance that Davian Gauss probably doesn't play all that much, if at all, this year, meaning that you'll have guys back there with zero experience that have not taken any sort of significant carries, maybe in garbage time in some of these games that are blowouts, but that would probably be about it. So they will need to go find somebody in the portal, and I feel like that'll be a position where Carolina would be able to attract somebody. We go from one position group where Carolina has done a really good job of developing guys to another position group that they've done that at, and that is the quarterback spot. And Carolina, of course, they have their 2025 quarterback, but now they have at least one of their 2026 quarterbacks. The reason I say that is that Carolina ends up landing Zay Lott, the unranked quarterback out of Providence Day. Lott, guy that was a backup last year to four-star quarterback Jaden Davis, who, of course, went on to Michigan earlier this offseason. And so now, he takes over that job. Well thought of player in the state of North Carolina. A lot of people with lofty expectations, including his high school head coach, Chad Greer, who has seen some of the best in the state of North Carolina and South Carolina over the past decade and a half. And so this is a guy with a lot of potential. But Zach, when you look at this commitment, it's one of those ultimate question marks, because it's a guy that a lot of people think could be the next great quarterback in the state, but it's also a guy that so far through to this point in his career, he has thrown the ball a grand total of 42 times. So a lot of questions here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're basically getting in on the ground floor of a guy like this. Like you mentioned, it has started maybe a game total in his high school career. Everything else has been mop up duty, basically, has thrown minimal passes. So the film on him is minimal as well. I think it's good from what I've seen. I think he's got good mechanics. I think he's really, really sharp in the short to intermediate. But again, you sort of have to keep in mind that a lot of what you're seeing in terms of that limited film is probably in situations where the game has been decided one way or the other. So with that, it's a situation where you are not seeing someone play in the full sort of pressure of a close game or sort of true live game reps to really see what you're getting there. So it's a situation where you sort of have to look at the traits and sort of project. Now, like you mentioned, Providence Day, where he'll likely start this coming season, is a program that's seen, itself sort of become a premier program in the Charlotte area and the state overall. I mean, you've seen multiple guys in the 24, 25, and 26 class that are, being recruited at a high level, being recruited nationally at the Power 4 level, really whatever, marker you want to put at it. This is a school that has a lot of, future college talent. So I think that that's going to help him develop to some degree. He's going to have guys that he can play with that are going to give him options, is going to give, the team options, but it's one that we're going to have to continue to watch. I mean, like you mentioned, there's a lot of promise there, but you are, sort of hitching your wagon to a guy that you know very little about, which is something that's it's a difficult risk in this day and age. But they need a quarterback. They felt good about some of the ones that they had in state that were options at this point. They have at least some film on. He did at least camp, so they did see him in a camp setting, like what they saw. But yeah, it's one where we're just going to have to wait and see. I'm excited. I like what I see in terms of the mechanics and the very limited film, but it's just, you really, really want to see those actual reps in sort of quote unquote real football scenarios. And that's what I'll be excited to watch this fall, to see, who's this guy going to be in terms of a prospect, and who's he going to be for UNC's 2026 class.
Yeah. I mean, here's the thing. It's important to get at least one quarterback in here early, typically in the summer before their junior year, because you look at all the other guys. Carolina has offered 9 quarterbacks in the class. Take Zay Lott out of it. You look and say, okay, well, how many other guys are committed amongst the guys that Carolina has offered? There are 6 of the remaining 8 that have committed. And one of the other guys is Faison Brandon, who I know a lot of people are probably saying, well, why wouldn't you just hold out and see what he's going to end up doing? Carolina's already out of the race for him. That's over. He's more than likely going to Tennessee. There's a couple other big names. I mean, this is a dude that, if you look at just 24/7's rankings, their composite rankings have him 30th, and they rank him as a 4-star. 24/7 Sports ranks him as the number 1 player in the country. So this is a guy that more than likely, when it's all said and done, he is going to be a 5-star prospect. So I think that's part of it. I also think you look at Bryce Baker, you looked at the way that he performed when he went out to the Elite 11 finals. He was pretty well regarded out there. He didn't have a great second day, but he was a guy that really turned it around on the third day in the 7-on-7s, threw 5 touchdowns and looked phenomenal. He's a guy that looks like he's the future of that quarterback spot. So it was going to be hard to follow landing a guy that is a 4-star. Now, granted, he's still a guy that's ranked outside of the top 200 according to the composite rankings, but something tells me he will be trending up and could crack that top 200 sooner rather than later with the performances that he's put on this offseason. And then, of course, once he gets back in season with East Forsyth High School, it's hard to follow that up with another highly ranked quarterback, especially in this era when guys are wanting significant amounts of NIL money. So a guy like Zayd Lott, who you don't really know a whole lot about, no pun intended, but at the same time, you still think that the tools are there. I think this is a worthwhile flyer to take on a guy like this. And I'm with you. There are some things that when you look at limited film, there's certain things that you need to see immediately. Two things I go to especially this day and age, right out of the gate. First throws that I see, I want to see arm strength, and I want to see, do they have a release that looks good? I think both of those are there for him. No questions asked. I think the arm strength is tremendous. And I also think there's other things that you see from him that you really like. His ability to lead receivers. And again, I think one of the things that you really like is that he's not playing with the top receivers. He wasn't playing with Jordan Shipp. He wasn't playing with Channing Goodwin, who were the stars last year at Providence Day. No, he was with the secondary group. And look, some of those guys are now going to be the first group. You'll see the guys that'll evolve and turn into highly rated prospects. He's going to have one in Gordon Sellers, who's a guy that Carolina is already in the 26 class as well. But when he's leading those receivers and making them look like guys that could be starting receivers, that's the type of things that you want to see from him. The running ability, not showcased a whole lot when he was on the varsity level. They were really wanting to showcase his arm, but he has the mobility. There's some JV film of him where they run a little bit more basic offense. They run the quarterback a little bit more. The legs are there. He's a guy that's going to be able to do that once he starts to take over that job full time, and they adjust the offense just a little bit. One of the other big things for me with him is the school that he's at is great. I think the talent around him is going to be phenomenal. There's another guy, Leo Delaney, if you're worried, well, they're losing a guy in the 2025 class in David Sanders, who's one of the best offensive tackles in the country. Well, they got another one coming up next year that's just going to be I wouldn't say he's as good as David Sanders, but he's really good as well. So he will be protected. But the biggest thing that I like is you got a guy in Chad Greer who has breeded these types of quarterbacks for years. He did it with his son. He did it with Sam Hartman. And, you see what he did with Jaden Davis. This is the next guy in line that I think has a chance to be a really good quarterback and to be taught by a guy that has basically been seen as a quarterback whisperer in this state, produces these guys over and over again. I think that's going to be huge. And another big thing is he could potentially be getting one of the state's best players coming into school with him this next year. Kendry Harrison, the 5-star tight end prospect, also 4-star power forward prospect that Carolina's offered in both sports. He's potentially thinking about transferring to Providence Day. This according to multiple reports from the Charlotte Observer, as well as a couple of papers up in the Reidsville area. That would be massive. So everything seems to be falling into place to get to learn a little bit more about this guy. But I'm with you. I think it's a flyer that they are definitely smart to take. And now you just see where it goes from there. All right. So we've talked to you about the guys in the 24 and the 26 class. Now let's focus on the cycle that Carolina is really locked in right now. And that is the 2025 class. And they had back-to-back days of commitments. And it started out with one that I think was probably the more important of the two. And we talked a little bit about this on the last edition of the podcast, Zach, that we felt Carolina needed another safety in this class. And with Kanoa Winston off to Michigan, you thought, okay, Carolina's got to turn somewhere else. And Julian Horton was the guy that Carolina locked in on. They were bringing him on campus for that final official visit weekend. And really all eyes were on him and what he would end up doing if he would take that visit. Well, he did. And with that visit being taken, pretty much confirmed that Maryland, not that he was going to decommit for sure, but that that commitment to Maryland wasn't 100% firm. Carolina did everything that they needed to do. Charlton Warren and the rest of that defensive staff pulled out all the stops, and Carolina ends up landing Julian Horton. And the thing is, Carolina already has one commitment in the class in Javian Butts at the safety spot. But with all that is leaving here after this season is over, and a couple other upperclassmen as well, Carolina really needed some depth here for the future, and they go and get it, Zack and Julian Horton.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the main thing that you look at when you look at sort of how this flip occurred, it's a big deal. I mean, you have a guy that's from the state of Maryland, was committed to the University of Maryland, which, in terms of their pecking order in the Big Ten, they're not Michigan or Ohio State. They're no slouch either. And you get a guy that's, recruited very well in that state and in that area specifically, in Maryland's head coach, Mike Locksley. This is a big deal that North Carolina was in to bring him in very quickly for a visit, got the decommitment, and then subsequently sort of finish it off with getting that commitment and fulfilling that need that they have for at least one more safety in this class. When you look at just who he is overall, the stats in terms of what he did on the football field don't necessarily blow you away. I mean, you're looking at 28 tackles, an interception, 3 pass deflections, not really a ton there, but plays mostly at free safety. So, he's back in the high school offenses. You're not seeing a lot of, layered throws. Maybe you'll see some deep throws here and there, but it sounds like he probably was not tested a ton. But then when you put on that film, my goodness, this does not look like a guy that's, in the 900s. This is a guy that is flying to the football, is flying to the ball carrier, is very instinctive in that regard, whether it be, getting the runner or even, in pass situations, he is coming up quickly and disrupting the football, plays with a lot of energy. There's a few snaps where he even, comes up in sort of a DB blitz and, gets to the quarterback. So he's got really, really good speed. He's not, incredibly tall. He's right at 6 foot, about 180 pounds. So, he's not this huge guy, but he's a guy that, really plays with a lot of intensity. I think that he plays well and plays through the offense. And so he's sort of a good contrast to a guy like Javian Butts that plays a lot closer to the line of scrimmage. Plays a lot of that nickel spot, or whatever that third sort of defensive back near the line of scrimmage you'd call would be. So it's a good contrast. It gives you more options to fill out those spots in the future, where, like you mentioned, you're going to have seniors and upperclassmen. You're going to have guys leave from the safety spot this offseason. So it's a position where they needed to fill that in this class specifically, and they've gone out and done it by getting the flip of Julian Horton.
Yeah, and look, I mean, when you watch his film, I think that's the most important thing. If you're somebody that's questioning this pickup because you look at the overall ranking, ranked 905th player in the class, that's not really going to blow anybody away. And it's, the thing is that I get it. It's concerning from the standpoint of Carolina's been landing bigger fish than that in years past. But yeah, when I turned on the film, I watched him and I said, man, this is a guy that I find it hard to believe that he's not going to be someone trending up, as they go throughout this year. You're right. I think one of the things that, you have to take into account, he's at the 3A level in the state of Maryland. Now, Maryland only has 4 classifications, so it's still the second highest classification, still pretty solid competition. But I don't think there's a lot of teams throwing the ball. And when you play free safety, typically you're not going to be the guy that comes down and helps as often as a guy that's playing short of that boundary safety, or as they used to call it, the strong safety spot. So I think that's more of what you see on his film. But when he is put into those scenarios where he has to cover ground, the speed shows up. I mean, he can close gaps just about as quickly as anybody. It allows him to make plays on the football. And that's really what you're looking for, are just guys that can make plays. I love his ball skills as well. I think he's a guy that is able to get the hand in there, knock the football away, at times come away with the interception. And the thing is that while he didn't have a ton of tackles, the one thing that you like to see from him is he's a very solid tackler. He's not a guy that takes a lot of risks. You don't see him overrunning plays and just getting lucky, having to make shoestring tackles. No, this is a guy with very good form. He wraps up. He goes low like you're supposed to, so it's not a guy that's just looking for the big hit. I like a lot of things about his game. And again, it's an upside pickup. Is there a chance that this is a guy that, potentially flames out? Of course. This is where Carolina is at right now with the guys that they are picking up. This is not a class where you're seeing the heavy hitters. There's a few of them at the top of the class, but once you get into the middle part of this class, it's a lot of guys that are probably going to end up being projects. For him, I think the biggest thing, it's probably going to take a little bit of time for him to make an impact, because he's going to have to be a better, or more involved rather in the run game, considering that Carolina's defensive line, unless things really drastically change, Carolina's defensive line isn't good enough in front of him in order for him to not have to worry that much about being involved in tackling in the run game. So I think that's the biggest thing that they have to see improved from him. Other than that, I think everything else is really there. And he'll be a guy that'll settle in behind some of those veterans that'll still be there next year. And then he'll have the opportunity, I think, in his second year. Maybe he has to wait until his third year to make an impact. But there's a lot of things to like about him. And more importantly, it adds to the depth in that room, which is the most important part. There are spots on this roster where Carolina needed to add guys to because of how many upperclassmen will be leaving after this season. This was one of the key spots, and they went out and got the job done. Well, Carolina wasn't done there. They then turn around and pick up a commitment from a 3-star interior offensive lineman. And this one, I'm not going to say completely unexpected, but, Carolina, we found out midweek, was going to host Byron Nelson. This was a guy that at that point they hadn't offered yet. And so he comes on campus. They do the same thing that they did earlier in the month, where they invited Jasper Parker, a 4-star running back, to campus, gave him the offer there, and then hosted him for the official visit. That one, of course, didn't go their way. This one did. And look, he was a guy that, came on campus. His other offers, the two that he was considering outside of Carolina, were Vanderbilt and Pittsburgh. So Carolina didn't exactly, beat some of the best in college football for him. And he's a guy that is ranked outside of the top 1,000 prospects. But this is still a guy that I feel like Carolina felt like they needed to add, especially with the guys that Carolina is bringing in out of the transfer portal. It is a rebuilt offensive line, but you do have some senior guys that are going to be graduating after the season. So I feel like Carolina, once again, looking at the depth, they felt they needed to bring in Nelson. And yet again, Zach, another guy with some high potential, but it's a guy that, when you look at it, isn't going to necessarily blow you away when you take a look at the rankings.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a guy that, similar to others here in this class, is probably going to be, more of a project. Is not necessarily a guy that is going to step on the football field day one and, grab a starting spot, but you never know. In terms of, where he's at, about the 6'2" to 6'3" range, right at around 300 pounds. So he is a Division I prospect in that regard. Plays at Katy High School in Texas, which is fairly competitive, in the state of Texas. Pretty, good competition that he's playing, so you feel good about that. When you turn on the film, you see him play primarily at right guard or right tackle. depending on the alignment. So you see a lot of run blocking. He does pretty good at that. Is not sort of the highest level in terms of his strength, but I do think he has a good motor. He finishes blocks. I think he does well there. And then, you do see some pass blocking that is a little bit at right tackle. So that is going to change. Most likely he's going to be an interior guy at the college level. And so therefore there's going to be a difference there in terms of, how he is asked to pass block and who he's asked to pass block. But, he's a guy that I think is, can be serviceable at the college level, and a guy that, as a junior or senior can be a very reliable option. But similar to Horton, like you mentioned, there are a few of those sort of heavy hitters at the top of the class, but sort of in that mid class, you're seeing guys that they are going to need to develop. And, regardless of if they're sort of guys that are in that top 500 or that blue chip range, or guys that are below that, this is something that the staff as a whole is going to have to continue to work on, because we've seen guys that have had sort of that recruiting pedigree come in and either transfer out to sort of lower levels or, not really meet that potential thus far. So the development of the guys that you have on roster, regardless of their ranking, is going to be pivotal over the next few seasons for the Tar Heels, as we're not seeing quite the level of pedigree or recruiting class in terms of that 10 to 15 range that we've seen previously. So this guy in Byron Nelson likely fits into that sort of similar mold, where you're going to need to take a few years into a strength and conditioning program to sort of build him up into a college player. But it's going to be incumbent on this staff to really continue to, show who they are as developers, and really find a way to, build this roster and to be sort of more than what it looks like coming out of high school.
Yeah, I mean, and let's be honest, I think at this point, Tar Heel fans should be open to that, because we've done the thing where we pick up these highly rated guys, even on the offensive line, and that hasn't really worked out. It's been guys that, maybe you weren't talking a whole lot about. Now it's transfers. Now you're talking about a guy that, was seen as a really good talent at North Texas in Howard Sampson. But, I mean, he wasn't a guy that multiple Division I programs were beating down the door for. I mean, this could be similar for Nelson. The thing that I like about what they've done along the offensive line, and Nelson is another one here as well. In this class, they have gone and found guys that have the size already. Because we always talk about when Carolina brings some of these guys in. A few years ago, they were bringing in some of the talent, especially at offensive tackle. I mean, one of the guys that I remember stands out the most to me was Eli Sutton, a four-star guy. Carolina brought him in, highly rated, great pass protector. There was a lot of potential there. Problem was he was so undersized. We still have yet to see him really take on any sort of big-time role. And so I think this is one of those guys. He comes in with the size already. Now you just have to figure out how to sort of clean up certain things and perfect his game. So I like that element. I think you look at his film, no question in my mind that he can run block. And you could say, well, he's overpowering guys, but how good are these guys? Katy, as you mentioned, it's a high school that I think a lot of people have probably heard of, or they've at least heard of the town. It's a 6A school. They play in the top classification in the state of Texas. They won 10 games last year. This is a good football team. And so I think this is a guy that, even though he isn't the most respected prospect out there when it comes to the rankings, he's a guy that plays on a good team. He's their best offensive lineman. And the other thing to remember, you mentioned it as well, he's playing at a position. He's a guy that's playing tackle right now because you're their best offensive lineman. That's how it works when you're at the high school level. And so I think that, when he's playing tackle, you're going up against defensive ends, guys that are going to be quicker than some of the guys that you're going to see at the next level. The one thing that I do wonder for him is that, even with the fact that, he has to play, tackle at this level, the thing is I know that there isn't a ton of talent, in terms of defensive tackles. I mean, there's certainly some good talent in the state of Texas. He would face some pretty good guys there. But they're, again, it's not what you're going to face when you actually get into the ACC if you get thrown into action against, let's say, Clemson's defensive line. This is still a guy that you wonder, because he's playing against smaller edge rushers right now, and those are typically the guys that he's matching up against. Will there be a little bit of, time needed to grow into his shoes as an interior guy? I do think the mean streak is there. We've talked about that so much over the last few years because it feels like with certain guys, it just hasn't been there. We see the guys that have the great lateral movement, that have the good hand placement, that have the good footwork, but they just don't have the physicality that's needed. He looks like a guy that has the physicality. The footwork's going to be more of the question for him, although on the interior, it's not nearly as important. And what is he going to be able to do against some of these stronger guys? If he can figure that out, I think this is a guy that has the potential to be a guy, in a few years that's competing to at least be a part of the rotation, if not be a starter. When it comes to the offensive line and even the defensive line to a certain extent, I think those are the positions where sometimes throwing out the flyers on guys that may not be the most highly ranked guys, but have the body makeup, that have the physical edge, it's never the worst thing to go ahead and give those guys an opportunity. So I like this move. I think it helps Carolina get a little more physical. I think it gives them the size that they want. And now we'll just have to see it pan out. But you talked about it. This class, I think, is really going to show us, is this staff ready to develop guys? Because we've been asking for it for a while. They've also made a lot of staff changes here. And you've got guys that, by the way, they're older. They're guys that haven't coached at the Power 4 level in a while. Or, they're guys that are just that weren't even college coaches. Look at Ted Monachino. Those are guys that, they have had to learn how to develop guys. That's what Ted Monachino was brought in to do. So you would hope that that's really what you're going to get from him, and that, his weaknesses in recruiting will be overshadowed by how well he develops guys. I think Randy Clements is a guy that's, again, he was at North Texas before he came to Carolina, isn't a guy that's had a ton of big jobs since Baylor, so he's had to get used to recruiting at a lower level. Even a guy like Jeff Collins, I know he was the head coach at Georgia Tech, was in the Atlanta area, a lot of really talented prospects there. Remember that he was basically having to shift everything that Georgia Tech had done for the better part of the last 2 decades under Paul Johnson and try to turn that team into something that it wasn't for so long. So even then, he was having to find a way to develop guys in order to actually get a team that could, produce week in and week out. I think it's really going to test the chops of some of these coaches, and we're going to see what these guys are made of. But, Zach, one of the things that I think you look at right now, what we talked about the pressure that Carolina maybe was starting to feel because they had not landed a commitment. I think some people are still a little on edge because they haven't landed a big fish just yet that they are going after. But for you, does the commitment of these 2 guys that we just talked about here at the end, does it take any pressure off of Carolina now that they've at least landed a couple of other guys in this class to go along with the group that they had entering the month?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it takes some of the pressure off. When you look at a guy specifically like Julian Horton, that's a position at safety that we sort of mentioned previously that, put a circle around it as somewhere that they likely need to add a guy, and they went out and did it. So the very fact that they had a need and directly addressed that need with a flip, no less, that's got to take some of that pressure off. Now, we are sort of waiting to see how these last few guys sort of pan out in terms of their commitments. And there's not really a ton of guys left in terms of this class that are on the board. You've got really one running back left on the board in Bo Walker that is still committed to Georgia. And, they're leaning more likely like they're going to try to keep his commitment. You have really one more defensive back in Oni Kinbandi that they're sort of fighting Tennessee and Florida State for right now. And then really after that, it's just whoever you want to get at wide receiver out of a few guys there: Micah Matthews, Malik Clark, Evan Haynes, and then Shamarius Peterkin, which we're going to see how that sort of shakes out over the next few weeks. But it's really 5 to 6 guys that they're looking at for a few spots left. And from there, you're going ahead and you're starting with 2026, but you're getting ready for the season, seeing if there's guys that sort of pop up in their senior year, which seems like it's becoming less and less of a phenomenon in more recent times. And then you're getting ready for after the season, you're looking to see who's in the portal, which we've mentioned previously. So the pressure is off to some degree, but there are still a few key decisions that they're going to have to watch over the next upcoming weeks. They're going to need to add a few in this class. Those are going to be very over the next few weeks. And then from there, I think that as much as the next few weeks are going to be important, it's going to be December, January, February, and then after that, March, April, that are going to be huge months for the Tar Heels. I think that's where they're going to put a lot of their focus is on the transfer portal, on that class to sort of fill in holes similar to what they did this past offseason where they took 10 guys.
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the things that I've kind of been telling people for a while with this 25 class is that you got to realize this is going to be a smaller class. You just brought in a class where you had 27 guys enrolled on scholarship. So, I mean, that's significant. And now you're adding a guy in Charleston French. That makes it 28. So that is as big of a class as we can remember. I mean, it may even rival the first class that Mac Brown brought in, which makes sense. That's a new staff. But it's almost unheard of, especially in this era of high school recruiting, to bring in a class that big. So with all those guys on scholarship, you knew it was going to be a pretty big class for Carolina. And you're right. The other thing that they have to juggle is you have to leave scholarships open for possible transfers. That's an important thing that you have to do with the transfer portal these days. So I think that's what Carolina is doing here. You mentioned it, that Carolina is really down to about 5 or 6 guys left in the class that they are targeting. There's a couple of guys. I mean, London Merritt's another guy that I know people are keeping an eye on. Seems to me like he's probably going to stick with his commitment to Ohio State. Bo Walker doesn't feel promising either, considering the fact that we are now over a week since he visited Chapel Hill, concluded that visit. Typically, if you're a guy that's going to flip, you're going to see it happen rather quickly, or you're at least going to hear some sort of buzz towards that. Doesn't feel like there really is that much towards that at this point. And so then you're right. Onis Konambani is the guy that everybody's kind of watching on the defensive side of the ball. Tennessee has done a really, really good job over these last couple of months. Feels like they put themselves in a good position, but you do have the pull for him, especially if Malik Clark ends up committing at wide receiver. Clark and him very close, both guys out of the state of South Carolina, and also a relationship there with Marshall Pritchett, the guy that is committed in Carolina's class, the 3-star tight end. So that could be a pull for him. But then, yeah, it really comes down to the 3 wide receivers. Malik Clark has already narrowed down his list, as we told you on the last edition. And then you've got the other 2 receivers who have narrowed down their decisions and have now officially set decision dates. Earlier today, Micah Matthews put the Tar Heels in his Final Four in a conversation with Tom Loy of 24/7 Sports. He also set his decision date. It'll be July 10th. So that'll be the next big date for Carolina to keep an eye on, barring somebody else deciding to set their date before then. Then you have Shamarius Peterkin, the in-state 4-star receiver that for a while looked like Carolina was out of the running for, but they're one of the final 3. Them, along with NC State and Virginia Tech, will be battling until August 16th, which is when he will decide. being an in-state guy, now Carolina's in a dead period. I think it's really important for this one. If Carolina is going to come from behind, because they are behind in this recruitment. NC State is a team that has been on him since his sophomore year. He has a great relationship with Joker Phillips, his wide receivers coach, and that's the main reason that they think it'd be shocking if he goes anywhere else. Lonnie Galloway is a guy that has done a great job recruiting at this position. If this is a guy that they really want, I think Lonnie Galloway going to have to turn up the communication. Can't be face-to-face, but you can still talk to guys virtually. Also, through text message, all that kind of stuff. But more so, it's going to be on the guys that are already committed to this class, talking to him and trying to get him to head in this direction as opposed to going to state. But, yeah, things are starting to come down to the end for all three of those receivers. And we'll see what Carolina ends up doing there. I think there's a good chance that Carolina in their mind, they want to add two of those guys. But I don't know if that's necessarily what it's going to be at the end of the day. Meanwhile, in the 2026 class, speaking of in-state guys, the Tar Heels did land in the top 11 for 2026 four-star athlete Samari Matthews, more than likely a guy that is going to end up playing the defensive backfield. This is a national recruitment guy that's playing at Huff High School in Cornelius. It's a spot that a lot of schools have come through for the last, better part of the last decade. And so once again, another guy that's a big national recruit. Is Carolina going to be able to keep up? Who knows? But Matthews is a guy that has been on campus a lot. So it feels like Carolina's at least established themselves pretty nicely out of the gate. All right, guys. Well, that is going to do it for tonight's edition of the Heel Tough Blog Podcast. I want to thank you guys, of course, for tuning in. Make sure you head over to the website. Check it out, HeelToughBlog.com. A ton of great stuff up there. Later tonight, that article about Micah Matthews and him setting his Final Four, the decision date. We'll dive a little bit further into that, tell you where Carolina kind of stands right now and the chances that they can end up coming away with his commitment. That article up there about Shamarius Peterkin, that you could check that out. And then, of course, all those commitment articles that we talked about are up there as well. I have started, getting some of the 2024 position previews rolling. So don't worry. We are going to talk about the on-field product here sooner rather than later. Those will start rolling out probably starting next week because there is another project that I sort of stumbled into that I think you guys are really going to enjoy. Speaking of recruiting, and that is the top 10 biggest busts in Carolina recruiting in the modern recruiting era. And then the top 10 gems that Carolina has found, some of those guys that were ranked pretty low but turned out to be really great players in Tar Heel uniforms. You won't want to miss that. Both of those will be on the website here throughout this week, so make sure you keep an eye out and check the website every day for all that. And, of course, any basketball news that comes out, whether it's recruiting stuff or any of the on-court action that Carolina has going on. Of course, tons of scrimmages going on right now here with all the camps that have been rolling through and a bunch of the alumni that are on campus. We've got to see the current roster go up against some of those guys, and some guys looking really, really good. So make sure you're checking that website every day for all of the latest Tar Heel football and basketball news. But that's going to shut it down once again for tonight's show. Want to thank Zack for hosting with me. Want to thank you guys for watching and listening. And as always, go Tar Heels.